Neil Lazarus here. What's happening in Israel today is a game changer. It really is the most dramatic change in the system of government in Israel, probably since its creation in 1948. It's not every day you see nearly 500,000 Israelis in a country with just around 10 million demonstrating. And again, it's worth pointing out that these demonstrations have been taking place on day of recording for over 10 weeks, and they seem to be getting more powerful. So what's the issue? Why are even Jews in the diaspora demonstrating about what's happening in Israel? And we're talking about some very loyal friends. Let's take a step back, try and understand the issues, and then I'll let you decide what you think. Effectively, the government of Israel has been pushing for changes that would limit the Supreme Court's power to rule against the legislature and executive, giving the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, the power to override Supreme Court decisions with a simple majority of 61 votes out of the 120-seat Knesset. What do I mean? A couple of things you've got to get. One, this is in America. We don't have two houses. We don't have a limit on presidential terms. We don't have representatives who are accountable to their electorate. In Israel, there's one house, the Knesset. The majority is 120. The seats, are 120. The majority is 61. So what is being proposed is that if the Supreme Court rules that the government has acted illegally, and what that means we'll discuss in a second, the Knesset will be able to pass legislation saying it's now legal. And two, perhaps even more drastically, the government will be able to pass legislation with a simple majority of 61 votes, saying that legislation which had been deemed illegal by the Supreme Court was now legal. A second proposal which is being considered is to take away the Supreme Court's authority to review the legality of Israel's basic laws, which basically acts as a country's constitution. Many people, including myself, fear that these legal reforms may diminish the checks and balances within the Israeli state. Let's step back again. In other words, look, in Britain, if there is legislation that goes through the House of Commons, you have the House of Lords. I'm not saying the House of Lords is the most democratic thing. It's not, but at least there's a check. You have Congress, you have Senate, okay? Most places have two houses. What Israel has is just one house. So what's often happened in the past, and we'll see how the historic precedent was built, is that the Supreme Court acts as a check. Now, those people who say that there should be reform, and by the way, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be some reform, say that the Supreme Court are not representative, they're not elected, why should they overrule the elected government? There's something here which is much deeper, and I think we need to stop right now. That was me stopping. Why? Because let's try and define democracy. Over and over again, I have discussions with people which say, well, the government was elected. These are people who the opposition doesn't like the results of the elections. They're doing everything to overturn the legally elected government of Israel, which represents the majority. There's a problem with that. First of all, the minority-majority issue. The difference was actually 30,000 votes. But let's leave that aside. They won the elections, and even Yair Lapid, the leader of the opposition, congratulated Netanyahu. That's not the point. The point is how we define democracy. You see, if you define democracy as elections every 4 years and then you can do whatever you like, basically there's no problem with the elections, with the recommendations and reform which is being suggested. The trouble is, I would argue, and many people argue, and I'm right, is that democracy requires more than that. It requires not only just winning elections, it requires checks and balances on power. It requires consideration for the minority. It requires a sense of the rule of law. It puts law and legality above political whim. Now, The problem, therefore, is if you don't have a system of checks and balances, the Supreme Court is really the only place that can put brakes on the wish of the politicians. So I'd take an exaggerated, example. Let's say that the government of Israel decides that everyone with blonde hair has to serve another 6 months of army service. Everyone with blonde hair could appeal to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court would rule whether that was legal or not. And that's going to be based on human rights law. We're going to talk about that in a second. And then the government would be accountable to it. A silly example, but not totally out there. In other words, the idea of minorities and minority rights and the guarding of those rights, I think, is an essential part of an Israeli democracy. It's not just winning the elections. But the changes proposed go even further. The independent panel for selecting judges currently requires politicians and judges who sit on it to agree on appointments. The present proposal, which is going through, would change that, giving the government far more sway. In other words, political appointments would take place of judges in the Supreme Court. Now, if that's part of a bigger game of checks, balances, two houses, representative government, etc., that's okay. But when the Supreme Court is the check on the legislature, and that legislature, or government rather, would be able to affect the judiciary to get yes people in, again, it's weakening that checks and balances. Ultra-Orthodox Jewish parties in the coalition want to pass a law exempting their community from conscription into the military, which they worry may be struck down by the court if the powers are not cut back. So again, what's interesting is it's not only the question of democracy here, it's also a question of demography. In other words, I think I've got to be careful what I say here. On the one hand, no, it's not just a bunch of Ashkenazim or, Ashkenazi Jews or anarchists seeking to bring down the government. The opposite. If you look at the people who are demonstrating, they do represent a vast majority of people. I've seen people with kippot in demonstrations. I've seen Mizrahi Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, high-tech, army people, certainly not anarchists. On the other hand, I think that there is a sense of demography here as far as who's been protected by the Supreme Court and who's not. So, for example, in a discussion I had recently, someone came up to me, a religious gentleman. He said, look, the Supreme Court is meant to represent minority interests. I agreed. He said, well, hold on, the Supreme Court ruled that it was illegal to have meetings which were separated between men and women in public spaces. In other words, if it's in public space, you can't separate men from women. Where are the rights of the religious? And I thought about it because I think it's an interesting point. And I think here we have to be very careful. Yes, the Supreme Court represents law, but law by itself is democratic and not necessarily religious. Is there a place for fear that the Supreme Court would rule against the interests of the ultra-Orthodox, even though they're a minority? Perhaps. But that would be in the case where that policy affects the majority. Life's not so straightforward. Look, there's another issue which is also kind of problematic. Have I lost you guys so far? I know it's complicated. Is of the question of the status of the Attorney General. According to the government basic law, a member proposed by Knesset member Simcha Rotman, is the guy who's pushing everything through. The government and ministers will be authorized to determine its legal position in any matter. So in other words, the government can decide whether a proposal is legal or not. At the moment, that's not the case. You see, furthermore, what they want to do is they want the government to be entitled to accept or reject the Attorney General's advice. So what they want to do is create a situation, propose a law. All blonde people have to spend more time in the army. they can turn to the Attorney General. The Attorney General can say that's illegal, but they don't want to be bound by that ruling. That's not the situation at the moment. Currently, according to the Supreme Court rulings, the Attorney General's legal opinion is considered to reflect, from the point of view of the government, the current legal status, as long as the court does not rule otherwise. So if, for example, we've had the Attorney General saying, you can't pass a law which gives immunity to Israeli soldiers against prosecution, that's illegal and won't stand up in international courts, the government has had to postpone that for up to a month. Once this is through, they can hear that advice, but not accept it. It may also be, for example, passing legislation which says a politician who has been in prison or committed not to be involved in politics, who now wants to stand to be a minister, i.e. Aryeh Deri, can be allowed in. When the Attorney General says they can't, that's a problem as it stands at the moment. Given this new legislation, the government would say, okay, we hear you, but that's what we're going to do anyway. So we've got a number of major changes. Recognizing the legality of legislation with a majority of 61. Backtracking on legislation which was proved as illegal, and now they want to make legal with a majority of 61. Changing the selection of judges so it becomes more political under the whim of the politicians, and changing the status of the Attorney General to advisory rather than as a legal ruling. The growth of the power of the Supreme Court could be traced back. Many people argue that in Israel, the parliamentary system originating in the UK, contrary to the American system, the executive branch sits in and is chosen from the parliament. Similar to the UK, a principle of this system is parliamentary supremacy, meaning that the Supreme Court does not have the power of judicial review and cannot strike down legislation. Those people saying we need to reform the system are saying the Supreme Court has got too powerful. It was never intended to have this power. It was never intended to be able to rule that governments were acting illegally. They argue that the role of the Supreme Court is to resolve specific disputes between parties and to ensure that the government adheres to the law. The place for policy decision is the Knesset. That, the argument goes, is not happening now. Now, things changed. Until the 1980s, the Supreme Court restrained itself from involvement in certain issues, relying on the doctrine of justiciability. This doctrine meant that there were certain issues which the court had no expertise in and was not within its parameters. A crucial turning point was the 1988 Ressler decision, in which the court struck down the defense minister's policy for exempting ultra-Orthodox yeshiva students from IDF draft. The court had previously held that the issue was a political social question and not judiciable. Justice Barak explained that there is no such thing as a legal vacuum and that all social questions have legal answers. That was the first time that the Supreme Court, in many ways, for many, overstepped its, overstepped its, what it should be doing, if you like. As the court limited the use of non-judiciability, expanded the doctrine to this idea of reasonableness, whether something's reasonable. Reasonable allowed judges to void any administrative decisions they held to be unreasonable. So if they thought the government was acting unreasonably, they could say that that was illegal. Many people say, well, hold on, who's deciding this? How do you decide this? How can you decide that the actions of a government which has been elected is not reasonable? That's not for you to decide. What the court began ruling on issues as diverse as how much the government should invest in bomb shelters near the Gaza border, setting up public inquiry into failures during the Second Lebanon War, and the proper path for Judea and Samaria security fences. Arguably, the critical stage in the court's ever-expanding activism came in 1992 with the passing of the Human Dignity and Liberty Basic Law and Freedom of Occupation Basic Law. These were the first basic laws, which basically act as a constitution in Israel, enshrining human rights. Once that got accepted and was acted effectively as a basic law within Israel, gave the Supreme Court a lot of power, because what it basically then said was, look, according to the Dignity and Liberty Law, which is now a basic law, by the way, it wasn't introduced as such, we can really make some far-stretched rulings for the Supreme Court. Many people argue they've overreached their power, they don't represent anybody, and the reform needs to take place. So, what do I think? I think a couple of things. Hopefully it's clear, okay? Let me summarize again. 1, the idea of legality of government decisions. The Supreme Court would not be able to say something is illegal if this legislation is passed through. The government could say it's legal with a majority of 61. The government can also say that that past legislation, which had been ruled as illegal by the Supreme Court, was now legal with a majority of 61. They also, like I said, mention the Attorney General. They want to make it from a ruling which defines legality to just an advisory ruling. They also want to change how Supreme Court's judges are elected to give favour to politicians. And what we've seen is an increasingly active Supreme Court ruling on issues which in the past were considered beyond the pale. What do I think? Well, I think that there has to be room for compromise. If there's room for compromise, and we're seeing that Herzog, the president of Israel, is suggesting compromise, we could perhaps see, yes, that the government can rule on legality, but let's not make it 61. 61 and just getting, anything agreed with a majority is not enough. 68, some people threw that number out, is not enough. Maybe 70, 75 members of Knesset could be a compromise. Again, the issue of the Attorney General. You see, the problem with the Attorney General is not the problem of the Attorney General. The problem of the Attorney General is the politicians involved. In other words, don't shoot the messenger. The messenger is saying, you guys are acting illegally. So I think that, again, the Attorney General acts in an important manner for acting as a check on legality, saying, guys, according to the law, you cannot do that. I think the only clash comes when you have governments which don't respect the law or the rule of law or the rights of minorities. Ruling that something is now legal which wasn't legal with just 61 is also remarkably damaging. We're also seeing legislation being passed which would say that the Attorney General cannot rule on the legality of the Prime Minister or fire him. In other words, you've got a situation where the Prime Minister can act illegally and no one can get rid of him. Unless he's sick, and then it's agreed by the majority of the Knesset. What we have at the moment is a situation where the Attorney General can rule saying that the Prime Minister is not fit for office if he acts in an illegal manner, i.e. has a clash of interests between what he's doing with the judiciary and his own personal court case. Reform, yes. Destroying the judiciary, 100% no. I'm very worried at the moment what could happen here. I'm very worried that we could get into a situation where Israel is no longer a democracy. We're already seeing the economic effects of this. We're seeing high-tech companies. By the way, the income tax, 25% of Israeli income tax comes from the high-tech industry. We're seeing high-tech companies pulling out. We're seeing the shekel being devalued. And this isn't before everything is finalized. Could there be violence between Israelis and Israelis? The potential for violence politically is there. I hope it's not going to happen, but we have seen situations like this in the past within Jewish history and within Israeli history. It's also interesting the effects it's having on the diaspora. We're seeing for the first time demonstrations against the government of Israel policy holding the Israeli flag. So in the past, we've had the wackos against Israel, Jewish Voice for Peace and all that lot. We're against Israel, whatever Israel does. Here we have solid supporters of Israel saying, because we support Israel, we're against what the policy of the government is at the moment, because we support a government which is democratic, recognizes the rights of minority, has a case for appeal, allows the citizen to stand up against the power of government through a judicial system. That could also be a crisis. Could this system also be, or change, also lead to a division between Israel and the diaspora? It's funny, I spend a lot of my time giving seminars on Israel and the Middle East. Maybe, just maybe, we get into a situation where Israel is becoming Middle Eastern. You see, we've always based our relationship with America and abroad, Britain, Australia, South Africa, with shared values of liberalism, of tolerance, of understanding the minority. Perhaps we're becoming more Middle Eastern, becoming more religious, becoming more less democratic in many ways, a Turkey, or if you want to go out of the Middle East, a Hungary or a Poland. I hope not, but I think in the weeks that follow, we'll see what happens. This is Neil Lazarus. I hope that helped you. Feel free to reach out, and if you've got questions, just let me know. Happy to clarify things I've said. And hopefully I'll see you again, either in Israel or abroad. I've just come back, been speaking abroad, and it's nice to be back on the road. Reach out via my website on Awesome Seminars, and we will speak soon.